A chip the size of a fingernail just claimed to do in 1 second what an NVIDIA GPU needs more than 15 minutes to finish. It does not use electricity to think. It uses light. For 2 decades, one company has decided the speed limit of artificial intelligence. That company is NVIDIA. China just announced it found a way around the limit entirely. In November of 2025, a research institute in the city of Wuxi unveiled a photonic quantum chip and claimed it could outperform NVIDIA's leading processors by a factor of 1,000 on certain workloads. Not 10% faster, not double. 1,000 times faster, on paper, for specific calculations that today choke even the most advanced silicon on Earth. To put that claim into context, NVIDIA did not become one of the most valuable companies in human history by accident. Its GPUs sit at the center of nearly every major AI system built over the last 10 years, from the chatbots people talk to every day, to the systems predicting weather, folding proteins, and powering self-driving cars. When a country announces a chip that could outrun that infrastructure by 3 orders of magnitude, even on a narrow slice of tasks, the rest of the industry has no choice but to pay attention. Like and subscribe, because the story behind that number is far stranger than the number itself. The chip was built by a partnership between the Chip Hub for Integrated Photonics Explore, known as ChipX, and a Shanghai startup called Turing Quantum. Together, they built something the industry calls co-packaged photonics, a way of fusing light-based processors directly with traditional electronics on a single piece of silicon. The chip runs on a 6-inch wafer made from thin film lithium niobate, a material capable of holding more than 1,000 tightly packed optical components in a space smaller than a postage stamp. Now understand what makes this different from a normal computer chip. Every processor you've ever used, from your phone to the most expensive NVIDIA data center card, runs on electrons. Electricity moves through transistors, switching on and off in patterns that represent ones and zeros. That system has powered the entire digital age. It also has a hard physical limit. Electrons generate heat, electrons resist the wires they travel through, and electrons can only move so fast before the chip itself starts to melt. Photons don't have that problem. Light moves faster than electricity ever can, generates far less waste heat, and can carry far more information through the same physical space. For decades, that fact sat in physics textbooks as an interesting curiosity. China just turned it into an industrial product. Scientists have known about the theoretical advantages of light-based computing since long before anyone could actually manufacture it at scale. The challenge was never the physics. The challenge was engineering, packing enough optical components into a space small enough to compete with silicon, while keeping manufacturing costs low enough to make the resulting chips commercially viable. That engineering gap is exactly what ChipX claims to have closed, and closing it changes the entire conversation around what comes after Moore's law eventually runs out of room. But that's not even the most aggressive part of this announcement. ChipX didn't just demonstrate a single lab prototype. The institute claims it is already producing 12,000 of these 6-inch wafers every single year, a number that signals an attempt to move straight from laboratory novelty into actual industrial scale manufacturing. The chip has reportedly already found its way into aerospace, biomedicine, and finance, industries that need to process enormous calculations quickly, and don't particularly care whether the processor inside the rack runs on electrons or photons. That production figure deserves a moment of attention on its own, separate from the speed claims entirely. Most quantum and photonic hardware projects around the world remain stuck at small batch prototype scale, producing a handful of experimental chips inside university labs, and calling each one a milestone. 12,000 wafers a year, if the figure holds up, represents something categorically different. It represents a supply chain, not a science project, complete with fabrication partners, packaging facilities, and quality control processes built for repeatable output rather than one-off demonstrations. Read that again slowly, because this is the part most headlines buried. The chip won the leading technology award at the 2025 World Internet Conference in Wuhan, beating out more than 400 competing technologies from 34 countries. Jin Xianmin, the physics professor who founded Turing Quantum, called the achievement of wafer-scale mass production of photonic quantum chips a world first. Like and subscribe, because a world first claim like that deserves real scrutiny, not just applause. Here's where the story gets complicated and where the headline "China beat NVIDIA" starts needing an asterisk. The 1,000 times performance claim does not apply to every task an AI chip performs. It applies to a narrow category of specialized calculations, the kind involving massive optical interference patterns and very specific types of mathematical sampling, for general purpose computing, the kind that runs your apps, trains everyday machine learning models, or powers the broad infrastructure of the internet. A photonic chip like this one cannot simply swap in for an NVIDIA GPU. Think of it this way. An NVIDIA processor is built like a programmable calculator. It can run almost any kind of instruction you throw at it, switching between tasks instantly, executing whatever code a developer writes. A photonic chip, by contrast, is closer to a purpose-built analog machine, exceptional at one narrow category of mathematics and largely useless outside of it. The comparison isn't really apples to apples. It's closer to comparing a race car built for one specific track to a car built to drive on every road in the world. This distinction is not a minor technicality. It is the entire reason data centers around the world still run almost exclusively on general purpose silicon, despite decades of researchers proving again and again that specialized hardware can crush a GPU on a narrow task. Specialized chips have existed for video decoding, for cryptographic mining, for specific scientific simulations, each one boasting wild speed multiples over general processors. None of them replace the GPU because none of them could do everything the GPU does. The question that actually determines whether China's photonic chips matter isn't how fast they run their specialty task. It's how much of the real-world AI workload that specialty task actually represents. Now here's where it gets genuinely disturbing for anyone betting against China's ambitions. ChipX is not the only Chinese institution making this kind of claim. Researchers at Tsinghua University built a separate hybrid chip called Axel, combining photonic components with analog electronics, capable of delivering 4.6 petaflops of processing power while consuming a tiny fraction of the energy a comparable NVIDIA chip would require. A companion chip from the same research lineage called LightGen reportedly outperformed NVIDIA's A100 by more than 100 times on tasks like image generation, style transfer, and denoising, the building blocks of modern generative AI. Multiple Chinese teams, multiple universities, multiple independent claims of massive speed advantages, all converging on the same idea at roughly the same time. That kind of convergence rarely happens by accident in a strategic technology race. It usually means a coordinated national push, not a single lab's lucky breakthrough. Like and subscribe, because the timing here is not a coincidence, and neither is the funding behind it. China's quantum technology investment in the first quarter of 2026 alone nearly matched its entire spending for all of 2025 combined. That is not the behavior of a government hedging a bet. That is the behavior of a government that has decided photonic and quantum computing represents one of the few realistic paths to leapfrogging Western semiconductor dominance, rather than competing head-on inside a fabrication race that America's export restrictions have made deliberately difficult to win. Now understand why that strategic logic matters so much. Years of American export controls have restricted China's access to the most advanced traditional chip-making equipment, the lithography machines, and fabrication processes that companies like NVIDIA depend on for their cutting-edge GPUs. Rather than spend a decade trying to catch up inside a race designed to keep them behind, Chinese researchers appear to be sprinting toward an entirely different finish. Line, one where the old rules about transistor density and fabrication nodes simply don't apply in the same way. This is the part of the story that should matter most to anyone watching the broader technology rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Export restrictions on advanced lithography equipment were designed around a single assumption, that the fastest path to powerful AI hardware runs exclusively through traditional silicon, through ever smaller transistors, etched by machines only a handful of companies on Earth can build. That assumption made sense for years. Photonics threatens to make it obsolete, because lithium neobate wafers and optical components don't require the same extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that sit at the center of the entire chip embargo strategy. That is the real story hiding underneath the 1,000 times headline. This isn't really about whether one chip beats one GPU on one benchmark. It's about whether an entire country can sidestep a technology blockade by inventing a parallel computing paradigm nobody fully controls yet. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions in the viral version of this story. NVIDIA is not standing still, and NVIDIA is not even pretending photonics doesn't matter. The company's venture arm, NVentures, has already poured investment into multiple quantum hardware companies working across different physical platforms, hedging its bets the same way any company defending a dominant position eventually has to. Separately, NVIDIA committed $4 billion across two photonics companies, Coherent and Lumentum, specifically to accelerate the move toward light-based interconnects inside its own future data center architecture. In other words, the company being declared beaten by China's photonic breakthrough is simultaneously one of the largest investors in the exact same underlying technology. NVIDIA isn't ignoring the threat. It's trying to absorb the technology into its own roadmap before anyone else can turn it into a true competitive weapon. There is a pattern here worth recognizing, because it has repeated throughout the history of dominant technology companies facing an emerging threat. The incumbent rarely denies the new technology works. Instead, it quietly funds the same research from multiple directions, hoping to control the timeline of disruption rather than simply outlaw it from happening. NVIDIA's leadership has spent the past 2 years talking publicly about quantum and photonic computing as complementary tools rather than existential threats, partnering with companies like PsiQuantum on silicon photonics manufacturing roadmaps that sound remarkably similar to what ChipX just claimed to achieve independently in China. Now here's where it gets genuinely disturbing for the optimistic version of this story. Even China's own most enthusiastic coverage admits the technology has serious unresolved problems. Manufacturing yields on these photonic wafers remain low compared to mature silicon processes. Nobody outside the labs producing these chips has independently verified the 1,000 times or 100 times performance claims under controlled, neutral testing conditions. And critically, nearly every public claim of overwhelming speed has been benchmarked against narrow, often cherry-picked tasks rather than the broad, general purpose workloads that actually define commercial AI infrastructure today. Low yield is not a small footnote in semiconductor manufacturing. It is often the single factor that determines whether a promising chip design becomes a commercial product or stays a laboratory curiosity for another decade. A research team can demonstrate a single working photonic chip under perfect laboratory conditions and still struggle to reliably reproduce that same performance across thousands of identical wafers rolling off a production line. Every defect in the optical alignment, every imperfection in the lithium niobate substrate can degrade the very advantage that made the chip exciting in the first place. China has not published independently audited yield numbers alongside its speed claims, and that absence is conspicuous. This is not a new pattern in the history of computing hype. Read that again slowly, because it applies to almost every X times faster headline you have ever seen in technology journalism. Specialized hardware nearly always wins dramatically on the narrow task it was purpose-built for. It almost never wins by the same margin once you ask it to do everything else a real data center actually needs. Like and subscribe, because understanding that distinction is what separates real technological disruption from a press release engineered to go viral. So is China lying? Not exactly. The benchmarks are real, even if narrow. The wafer-scale production claims appear genuine, even if yields remain a documented problem. The performance multiples are accurate for the specific tasks being measured, even if those tasks represent a sliver of what a modern AI data center actually has to compute every single day. What China has done is something more interesting than an outright lie. It has found a genuine technological edge in a narrow but commercially relevant slice of computing, industrialized it faster than almost anyone expected, and then let global headlines do the exaggerating for free. Nobody in Wuxi needed to inflate the story. The phrase, beats NVIDIA by 1,000 times, was always going to travel around the world whether the full context came along with it or not. Compare that to Hanyuan 2, another Chinese system debuted around the same period, and described as the world's first dual-core quantum computer. Another superlative, another headline. Another reminder that China's quantum strategy right now isn't built around one single miracle chip, but around an entire pipeline of overlapping claims, each one reinforcing the perception that the technological center of gravity is shifting east. Notice how each of these announcements, taken individually, might be dismissed as an isolated press release chasing headlines. Taken together across multiple universities, multiple cities, multiple distinct hardware architectures, and multiple government-linked institutes, they start to resemble something closer to a coordinated industrial strategy. Photonic chips from Wuxi and Shanghai, a dual-core quantum machine from a separate research effort, massive year-over-year jumps in national quantum investment. None of this. Looks like a single lucky breakthrough. It looks like a country methodically testing every available pathway toward computing dominance simultaneously, betting that at least one of them breaks through to genuine commercial scale before its rivals catch up. That perception matters almost as much as the underlying physics. Global capital follows confidence. Engineering talent follows momentum. Government funding follows headlines that suggest a nation is winning a race, even when the actual finish line of that race remains years, possibly a decade, away. China appears to understand that dynamic as well as any country on Earth right now. Now consider what happens if even a fraction of these photonic claims hold up under independent, neutral scrutiny over the next several years. A specialized accelerator chip that handles AI's most demanding mathematical workloads using a fraction of the electricity, manufactured using domestic supply chains, immune to American export restrictions, deployed already inside aerospace, biomedical, and financial infrastructure. That is not a toy. That is the foundation of a genuine alternative computing ecosystem, one that doesn't need NVIDIA's permission, NVIDIA's chips, or NVIDIA's roadmap to keep advancing. In that scenario, the implications extend far beyond corporate balance sheets. A country capable of training and running advanced AI systems on entirely domestic hardware gains something far more valuable than market share. It gains immunity from future sanctions, future export controls, and future supply chain disruptions that have repeatedly disrupted its access to Western chip technology over the past several years. Every additional photonic wafer rolling off a Chinese production line is, in a sense, another brick in a wall designed to make the next round of American sanctions irrelevant before they're even announced. And consider what happens if the claims don't hold up. If yields stay low, if the 1,000 times multiplier turns out to apply only to a vanishingly narrow set of laboratory tasks, if the gap between demonstration and deployment stretches on for years, the way it so often does in quantum computing, then this story becomes another chapter in the long history of technology nationalism. History offers plenty of cautionary examples for this exact pattern. Multiple nations, across multiple decades, have announced computing breakthroughs timed perfectly to coincide with political moments, trade negotiations, or national conferences, only for the underlying technology to quietly stall once independent labs tried to reproduce the claims. That doesn't mean every Chinese claim in this story is destined to fail. It simply means the appropriate level of confidence right now sits somewhere between blind dismissal and uncritical celebration, and headlines rarely have room for that kind of nuance. Like and subscribe, because which version of this story turns out to be true will shape who actually controls the next era of artificial intelligence. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath both possibilities. Even if China's specific claims get diluted by future independent testing, the broader direction is now undeniable. Photonic computing is no longer a theoretical curiosity confined to physics departments. It has a production line, a supply chain, an award ceremony, and 3 different research teams across 2 countries racing to scale it before anyone fully understands its limits. Every major shift in computing history followed a similar arc before the world recognized it as inevitable. Vacuum tubes seemed permanent until transistors made them obsolete almost overnight. Mainframes seemed permanent until personal computers redefined who could even own a computer. Classical GPUs seemed permanent until a handful of researchers realized they were unexpectedly perfect for training neural networks, a discovery that built NVIDIA's entire empire almost by accident. Each transition looked in its earliest years exactly like this. Scattered claims, narrow use cases, skeptical incumbents, and a production number that sounded too aggressive to be believed until, eventually, it wasn't. That history doesn't prove photonic computing will follow the same trajectory. Plenty of promising paradigms never escape the lab at all, swallowed by manufacturing costs, yield problems, or competitors who simply optimized the old technology faster. Then the new one could mature. But it does mean dismissing the story outright simply because today's claims sound exaggerated would repeat a mistake technology observers have made at nearly every previous inflection point in computing history. NVIDIA built an empire on being the company nobody could route around. Every major AI breakthrough of the last decade ran through NVIDIA Silicon, sold at margins that turned the company into one of the most valuable corporations in human history. China's photonic gambit is not a guarantee that empire collapses, but it is the first serious industrialized attempt by a rival nation to build a road that bypasses the toll booth entirely. The chip that allegedly does 1,000 seconds of work in 1 second isn't proof that the AI hardware war is over. It's proof that for the first time in years, the war has a second serious battlefield, one built from light instead of electricity, and one where the rules everybody assumed were permanent are suddenly very much up for negotiation. Now consider the global ripple effects beyond just 2 companies and 2 countries. Every other nation racing to build sovereign AI infrastructure, from the Gulf states to the European Union, is watching this exact rivalry to decide where to place its own bets. If photonic computing genuinely scales, smaller countries that could never compete with NVIDIA's traditional silicon supply chain suddenly have an alternative entry point into advanced computing, one built on different physics and potentially different geopolitics altogether. What happens over the next 18 months will likely determine which version of this story gets written into the history books. Independent benchmarking, real-world deployment numbers, and yield data that nobody can spin will either confirm China has built something genuinely transformative or reveal a gap between announcement and reality that mirrors countless technology promises before it. Either way, the conversation around who controls the future of computing has permanently changed, and NVIDIA, for the first time in a decade, is no longer the only name in that conversation.